going to proceed. This is my outline, an introduction, then tell you what my findings were, a short, brief discussion, and then we look at some recommendation. From Christopher Columbus' time until now, Tobago has changed immensely. And I want to put that in perspective of 4 periods, as you would see in the presentation. Even before I continue, I'm afraid based on the topic that I have to deal with, I must give you 3 definitions. Wherever you see in the topic or the theme, forestry, one of the definitions here for this presentation, it is that it is forest land. So I'm overlooking that forestry has to do with the science and art of so on, so on, so on, so on. So, forest land. I must also tell you, it's interesting that we have this coming, that FAO defines forestry as, as one where you have the land with more than 10% tree cover. Secondly, it also states that the area of the land has to be at least, or must be, more than half an hectare. And the trees are expected to get to about 5 meters tall. And given that we connected it with FAO, notice this last part. Forest excludes land predominantly used for agriculture. We'd always have that clash here in Tobago, and please really pay attention to that. I should tell you also, for this presentation, pristine means several things, but the 3 key words of pristine is that of natural, unspoiled, and intact. For instance, World Resources Institute calls pristine wilderness, intact forest landscape. My aim is to make the case for establishing and maintaining pristine forests and a green environment in Tobago. Notice I've slightly changed what I was given to do. And there are reasons for that. My approach is that I've searched search for information from various sources, and I've listed them here. And what I've done in order to do this presentation, I've done a content analysis. So I take it from here. I must also tell you that in dealing with forestry matters, especially at a time like now, there are some concepts and there are some trends that must be considered. These aren't all, but in my opinion, these are some of the key ones. Don't overlook postmodernism, and don't overlook climate change and green tourism. So now, findings and discussion. In the colonial period, a time back as far as 1498, one presupposes that when Columbus sighted Tobago and he called it Bella Fauna, that all of Tobago was pristine and green. That may not necessarily be the case, but following that in 1776, we boast about the Managed Forest Reserve, and when it was set aside for watershed purposes or water purposes, we assume that it was also pristine and green. As a matter of fact, the size of it at that time was only 8% of Tobago. It has grown since then, or it has been extended. Still, in 1904, this is the time that the Managed Forest Reserve was extended. So it's now presently 13.5% of the land space of Tobago. And still, at that time, Tobago, we presume and assume or presume was pristine and green. Further to that, though, we had some setbacks or challenges. We had Hurricane Flora in 1963, which took out about 67% or more of the vegetation of Tobago, and ironically, it was called Flora. We had a terrible drought. Since the time, as far back as I can remember, one of the worst drought we'd had in Tobago is that in the 70s. I think it was 75 or 76. So when we had that drought, much of Tobago appeared brown and there were a lot of fires. In the autonomous period, which is the last of the 4, Managed Forest Reserve was then, well, it's now presently 13.5%, and it's still pristine and green, with a lower montane rainforest that J.S. Beard referred to. There are 2 other rainforests, but they are more or less outside of the reserve. In terms of maintenance, remember we're looking at establishing and maintenance of private forestry. In terms of maintenance, I suggest that we keep the managed forest reserve as for water cycle benefits or the hydrological cycle benefits. I also recommend that we keep it for its nature tourism purposes. And if there are storms, one of the ways we have dealt with this in the past is by practicing the shelter wood system and removing the debris so that the forest can grow back as quickly as possible. As quick as 30 to 35 years. It is not true that a forest takes 100 years to come back to its climax stage. I want to move on to Little Tobago. One of the other areas we think that we have is pristine, is Little Tobago. And in the 18th century, all of Little Tobago was cleared and planted with sea island cotton. During the independence period though, J.S. Beard identified the forest type that we have there, the dry forest or deciduous seasonal forest. And folks, this is the only one we have in Tobago right now. All the others are mosaics, so scattered or small. In 1963, well, we had Hurricane Flora and we had the drought that affected the previous one. So, in terms of Little Tobago, it is still the largest dry forest remaining, and that is 1% of the land mass of Tobago, roughly 1%. And it's still pristine and green. Aren't we fortunate? In terms of its maintenance, I suggest that we keep it still as a bird sanctuary, as a prohibited area. However, I think we should continue to allow visitors to visit it, but at a cost or several fees. Nature tourism for international birders, we should still keep it for that purpose because there are many seabird nesting there. We should continue to protect it from fire because it's a deciduous area and it can succumb to fires easily. Interestingly, so what this adds up to is that about 15% of our land mass or land space or overall Tobago, I would argue, is pristine. And at least that amount is green. I'm not aware of any other pristine area. However, in terms of whether we could create pristine areas, that's a debate that has to be taken. Perhaps we could consider one of the wetlands and try to remove some of the pollution and perhaps make it pristine, but it would be costly, it would need community input and a whole lot of other logistics. I want to move on now to the green aspect. Having handled the pristine, there's only two areas that I need to handle. So if at least 15% of Tobago is pristine and green, what about the other 85%? Well, bear in mind that our branding for Tobago is related to the CEDP 1 and 2, and it talks about clean, green, safe, and serene. Well, let's continue. In the colonial period, Andrews in 2005 told us that, where is that for you? 72% of Tobago was used for agriculture. It's no wonder that Tobago was the bread basket of Trinidad. And that was what year? That was in 1946. But notice the trend. By 1962, only 45% of Tobago land space was used for agriculture. And it's not, I purposely put in the definition for forest there telling you that you have to exclude lands used for agriculture. There may be some situations here. In the autonomous period, in 2004, only 7%, folks, just 11 years ago, Tobago was used for agriculture. So what's happening? Much of that land that was used for agriculture is green. They are reverted to what we call secondary forests. So perhaps I could just pack up and leave now. All right. What has happened also, we have had increased development. So maybe no big matter about that. But here's an interesting thing. In 2007 and 2009, the Managed Forest Reserve, in collaboration with tourism and based on a document that we wrote, we were able to capture World Travel Award as the world's leading green destination twice as a result of that. The photo you're seeing there, this is a GIS production of the vegetative type or life zone or association in Tobago. And this is the one I suggest that we use these days. This was initiated in 2011 and completed by 2013. So it gives you an idea where you find green spaces and the different forest types. Challenging landscape. Let me continue by letting you know that what have we done in terms of keeping Tobago green, apart from what I've just told you. Well, the Botanic Garden in the autonomous period, no. Botanic Garden is before that, sorry about that. 1890s was 25 acres in size, but now it's about 15 to 17. And people love to go there for the greenery, the shade, and many other reasons. We've collaborated with communities, we've collaborated with URP and with NGOs, and we've replanted some of our coastal areas that were eroding. And so we've had some mitigation taking place in some of the coastal areas, and therefore they're green. We particularly use species that fall into what you call a littoral woodland, as listed by J.S. Baird. But Claude Noel Highway in 2001 or 2002, Darren will remind me of that, we took on the initiative to plant ornamental trees and shrubs along the Claude Noel Highway. And that is continuing with the help of the IPU and with the help of some NGOs. Folks, every dry season, I'm certain that many of you here are persons who would have said, wow, when you see the yellow pui flowering. Haven't you? Well, apart from that, you have, and the yellow pui, by the way, is native to Tobago. Apart from that, you have the flamboyant tree and several other species there. I'm not certain, so I didn't put the percentage here, but some of the good thing also is that the town and country planning have mechanism in place to ensure that we keep much of Tobago green. It could be 15% of each housing plot should be kept as green space for porosity, that is for water to infiltrate and percolate downward, but I'm not certain about the percentage. There's also a mechanism in terms of development, that all development, major development, provides some sort of green space once that is taking place in Tobago. So here are my recommendations, and I conclude. Tobago, one of the approach we have used is not just wildlife, but one of the initial approach we used in managing Tobago forestry was that of watershed, the watershed approach. We've gone back to that, and one of the reasons is because the managing Tobago from the point of view of looking at it as parish hasn't worked, and also using the real watersheds like Corland watersheds has not really worked. One of the things that is working for us is by using WASA's definition of watershed, and there are 15. So I recommend that we continue to do that. Here's something that has worked for us in Tobago in terms of green forestry, that of private forestry. Do you know that most of the timber trees coming from Tobago are coming from private landholding? Yes, 99% based on the data that we have analyzed. I suggest that we continue to do that. And not only that, from a research that I did for my thesis on abandoned lands, one of the recommendations is that we need to look at initiatives that have encouraging persons who have abandoned their agricultural lands and their other lands to plant timber trees on them until they're ready to do agriculture or any other development. Chances are if you want to do agriculture, you just remove most of the trees and leave one or two. Like long ago, they used to tell you at least plant, or grandparents used to say at least plant one tree, a cedar tree or mahogany. So in case anybody died, when it matures, you could use that for making coffin. All right, so with value-added products, and by planting the trees, the value of the land would go up. And this would lend towards a new trend, a recent trend called green economy. And that would more or less help in that. I suggest we use a little Tobago and the Managed Forest Reserve as part of the green economy. So it means that we had to charge some fee, and that would go towards the Tobago House of Assembly in some way or the other. We're still working that out. Green tropical with various shades of green is good for reflecting solar radiation, aesthetics, leisure, oxygen production, and well-being. I can't overlook well-being, so I put it in. So just relaxing in a serene place like the Managed Forest Reserve can help you in terms of your well-being. And last three, we keep coastal areas, I recommend we keep coastal areas green while mitigating against coastal erosion. Folks, don't be surprised that you see Tobago be used, if you see Tobago used as a model or an example of coastal erosion mitigation procedures. Somebody came to us, and I'm not certain how far they go with it, but they really fell in love with the fact that we are planting grape and coconut and almond along our beaches that can help to counter this high tide situation in terms of coastal erosion. Crucial in planting trees, I think we now have to know, because of climate change, global warming, and other factors, we now have to emphasize the selection and use of species within their range. What this means? Using trees that are native, using trees that falls within, if you plant them and you have climate change, the resilience is far better. I also want to add, given if we're going to get into agriculture and other development, we must start talking about putting corridors to connect developed areas so that animals can move under shade and cover. I conclude in terms of recommendation by reminding you what we could continue to do. One of them I don't have here is community forestry. Continue that. Add some more parks like Corland. Do you know one of our parks is highly used now? Probably overused, the Corland Park. Further gardens and further open spaces. I want to thank the Office of the Tree Secretary, THA, collaborating stakeholders, the DNRA personnel, and here are some references. Thank you very much.